In order to succeed as a microgreen grower, you have to be a cross between an automaton and a scientist, doing the same task over and over and over, while keeping good results and analyzing those results. Stay tuned to find out what this all means coming up. Welcome to the Growing Microgreens podcast. I'm your host, Diego, D-I-E-G-O. Over the last 2 episodes, we've looked at how Chris started and grew his microgreens business. And we've taken a look at what's possible with that business when it grows. And if you just stand back and look at those numbers, they're jaw-dropping. But nonetheless, Chris has shown what's possible. And given that, and the relatively low capital investment required to start a microgreens business, it's a business that attracts a lot of people. People that likely focus on the high dollar value per tray, and people that dream about how much money that they can make. This is where it gets dangerous, because you can't just look at the income side of the business. You have to look at the expenses as well. When you start to do that, that high dollar per tray isn't as high as it might appear. There's a decent amount of labor that goes into producing each tray of microgreens, labor that needs to be priced into the product, and labor that might turn some people off from growing microgreens in the first place, especially when people enter the business looking to make a quick buck or chasing the romanticism of farming. If you're thinking about starting a microgreens operation, there's a lot to consider, especially the negatives. Today we're going to take a look at those negatives and go beyond the $50 tray and take a look at the tedious, detail-oriented reality of growing microgreens as a business. So I want to run through a hypothetical that I think is a pretty realistic hypothetical. I've read a lot about microgreens online, and say I came to you and said, I'm really interested in starting a microgreen business. I think it's awesome that you can sell these microgreens for 30, 40, 50 bucks a tray. You don't need any land. I can do this in my basement. This is the farming opportunity that I've been waiting for. I'm so excited. What would your response be to that?
That's not the first time I've heard that. I've heard many variations of it. There's a couple things in that stand out for me. And it's typical when you see the revenue potential of something to forget the expenses and costs that go with producing that product. I suffered from that. I was like, wow, 25 bucks a tray, 20 trays a week. That's like 500 bucks a week, times 4 weeks. Wow, that pays my rent and a bunch of bills. And then you get into the reality of all the expenses, your seed, your soil, your time, all that stuff. And it does add up over time. So that's the first thing that comes to mind is you've got to keep in mind what your net return is in your business. And then the second thing is, and I'm lenient on this because I've been the guy who says, I'm going to do this in my living room, in my bedroom, in my basement, in my garage, and I've done all of them, is those are great models for prototypes, but that's not where you run your business at. Even though, once again, for a short period of time, I did do that. You need to think about what your business looks like when it's successful or semi-successful. And you can't run a food production business out of a bedroom, living room, basement, theoretically. There's a lot of barriers in that. And I don't know that we'll get into that, but the lesson there, I guess, is plan. When you're planning and looking forward to something like this, you need to plan for success. And a successful microgreens business, however you define that, probably isn't being run out of your living room. It's being run out of a designated space. And there's a lot of reason for that. So yeah, those two things really stand out. It's the space you do your growing in, and then it's just understanding the business expenses and all the tasks associated with the production cycle.
Okay, let's start there. That's a good spot just on the space itself. So say I'm thinking about doing this and I want to do this serious. I've never done it before, and I'm thinking I want to focus on this enterprise, and this is going to be my sole farming enterprise. I'm going to go all at this. When I start to look at a space, what are some of the considerations I should look at from a more macro level? I'm thinking, one, you're going to want kind of processing area nearby. You're going to want cold storage nearby. You're going to want someplace where you can either have good natural light and or supplemental light. How would you start to advise somebody on, if you're thinking about growing, this is how you want to think about the space? Because you can go vertical with these. So the other thing I'm thinking here is, how do you address the footprint issue if you're building something from scratch?
So the reality is, for most people, they're probably not going to just go on a microgreens endeavor. They're probably doing something already, and they want to add microgreens to a component of it. The business I'm with now, we are an exception to that. We solely do microgreens, but most other growers I know do it as a component of a bigger farming system. So when you're thinking of going into the microgreens realm, the one thing I'm thinking about is, well, what infrastructure do you already have that you can use? You probably have greenhouse space or hoop house space where you can do production. You've probably already got a wash up area that you're using for your vegetables, so that can double as a microgreens area. So there is that. That's something to keep in mind. If you've already got something going, you've probably done some of the work. But let's step back and look at your question from a starting from scratch point of view. What does your space look like? We're an urban system, so it's going to depend whether you're urban or rural. That's going to be one thing. Your options in an urban setting are going to be few and far between, really. And then once again, you need to think about, if your business grows, is it going to be able to do that in that space? So the model we have, I originally conceptualized it as a backyard model, but it outgrew that size almost immediately. The backyard size, unless it was a very, very big backyard, wasn't big enough. Because, as you mentioned, we needed production space, we needed processing space, we needed to store our soil somewhere, and then our compost that we had afterwards. We'd want a storage shed for our supplies, a designated wash-up area, and then what I would call just space. You tend to need space to move around, bring vehicles or bicycles or wheelbarrows in and out. So pretty quickly, your footprint will often grow much bigger than you're anticipating. Now, one way to reduce that footprint is by using your vertical space, but it is going to be limited in how many components you can increase the vertical aspect of and how high you can go.
So thinking of that, part of designing the space, I guess, is thinking, where do you want the business to go and what's the potential to scale the business? You run, I think, a pretty large microgreen operation that's not like a mass industrial size microgreen operation. If somebody's thinking, I'm starting this new, but I plan on growing, you run an operation that's pretty big. How big do you think they should realistically look to size this when they're making their initial setup? Because it could be, I'm thinking, if you're an urban farmer, you might start on 2,000 square feet and eventually move up to a third of an acre or half an acre or an acre. There's a lot of scaling there. Where on microgreens, I think there's some ways that you could combine that space to make it more effective. And also, at some point, your market's not going to be able to absorb all that product. So how do you think you kind of blend where you want the business to go and estimate, what's realistic of being a big microgreen business and then sizing to potentially hit that one day, but making it realistic now?
Yeah, so, well, let me talk, and I don't mean to drill over things I've talked about in the past, but I'll talk a little bit about how I grew. So the first way I did, and I spent a lot of hours fretting over this, was, where am I going to grow these microgreens? And I thought about greenhouses, hoop houses, and whatnot, but these are structures. And in an urban setting, they're considered buildings, and there's a whole bunch of hoops you need to jump through to put up a building, whether that building is a skyscraper or that building is a greenhouse. You still have to jump through some hoops. So I wanted to start with something that wasn't a building and that could be expanded. And so what I did is I built a series of benches in 4x8 sections, so I could use plywood and coroplast sheets that were just covered, and they had an easy opening door. So I started with a number of sections of that, and I knew that I could build a new one in about 3 hours. So I built about three. So I had three 4x8 sections, and in each of those sections, I could grow about 20 trays. So I had 20, 40, 60 trays production space right away. And so already I've got a design that it's like, we're getting more orders than we anticipated. I'm going to build another section. So it allowed me to add on to what I already had. So the design was considered growth in the beginning. And so at that point, I thought about the possibility of scaling up, but it's one of those things is, you don't know what you don't know. So what I didn't know is what the ins and outs and the logistics and the day-to-day routine of running a microgreens business would look like. So I had to run the business for a little while to get a sense of that. And, it took within 2 years, I had a very good sense of that. And using that same model was able to expand it. So expanded the growing space, expand these benches, and intensify production because as I got to know the production cycle better, I knew how to make better use of that space. So at a certain point, so in the beginning, in terms of growth, we just did the summer period. So I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia. We have a summer and we have a winter. And during the winter, theoretically, you can grow, but it's quite difficult without supplementary light and heat. So it was designed as a summer production system. The inevitable expansion of that to me was to take it year round. So to go from 5 months to 12 months. And that already theoretically more than doubles your revenue right away. So to do that, our thing was, okay, well, now we're going to invest a little more. We know the system. We know there's a market. We know we can run things very, very smoothly. So let's take a leap. It's difficult to take a big leap in the beginning unless you're very well funded and you've got a good knowledge base or a good consultant base. So at that point, I was like, we know the market's there. We're going to take the leap. And we basically, our leap was from these benches to a greenhouse. Now our greenhouse in our case is a shipping container converted into a greenhouse, but it could have easily been a double-walled hoop house that had lights and supplementary heat. So it doesn't matter what the bigger structure is. So the bigger structure did two things. It extended our season, but it also, as you referred to earlier, it allowed us to use the vertical space better. So instead of having a single plane on which we grew, we now had 3 levels. And so not only did we lengthen our season, but we were able to basically triple the amount of production space that we had. And it's interesting because our footprint actually didn't change. Our square footprint of production space didn't change with the new greenhouse, but our vertical space did.
Given all that, if somebody's starting out, I love the idea of what you said of you don't know what you don't know. One thing, using urban farming as an example, Curtis always says, don't start too big. Start with a 1/4 acre or less, get that working, and then scale as needed, if needed, when you have the funds, when you know more, when you have the market. Do you have kind of a default that you would advise somebody new who's going into microgreens? What I'm thinking is, hearing all that, maybe that prototyping stage of indoors in a basement makes sense at the beginning because you don't know your level of interest and you don't know really, you can do some research in what the market's going to bear, but then you just use the model that you did. Maybe you start indoors and then you expand out as needed, as your knowledge grows, as you know more about the system, your customer base, all that.
That's a general strategy for almost any business model, right? You need to build the skills in order to build the business. So you need to develop your skill, understand the business, understand the growing. You need to prove to yourself you can do it. And if you do want to grow and expand, if you don't have the capital to do it, you're going to need to borrow it. And nobody's going to give you money if you don't have a skill set behind it. Nobody's going to fund you to figure out how to grow microgreens when there's people out there that can do it. I think those are important things to consider. At the same time, like, to kind of contradict what I've said, you need to anticipate what it's going to look like when you grow. So when I developed the model, so first of all, I had 7 years of crop, field crop experience. So I'd grown a lot of vegetables. I'd done farmers markets. I'd done sales. So I knew what that model looked like. And I also knew microgreens were sort of semi-regulated. So in Canada, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in the United States, microgreens are now very much viewed as sprouts. And so they're a high-risk product that has pretty strict sanitation and hygiene requirements. And so that was always on my mind because I knew as we grew bigger, we would become more scrutinized. We need to be more accountable for what we do, because we would go from selling at farmers markets to selling to grocers, to selling to restaurants, to selling to bigger grocers. And when you start selling to bigger grocers, they've got their own liabilities to consider. So they're asking you questions like, do you have a sanitation and a HACCP program? Are your coolers at the right temperature when you're doing deliveries? Where are you sourcing your seeds from? How often do you test your products? And if you can't jump through those hoops, they're not going to buy from you. So if you're looking at what your business looks like when it's successful, have those things in mind from the beginning, because even though you're not doing them, you're prepared when they come. And as your business grows, it's not just like, sales are increasing. If I sell a few more trays, I'm going to have this much more money. As your business grows, you're going to have to keep putting money into it to keep up with that. Kind of like children. You think, we're through that stage. And it's like, oh, yeah, now all your clothes don't fit, so I need to replace them. And now you're doing this at school, so I need to pay for that. So it evolves. So by having a sense of what it's going to evolve into, you can design your system to be prepared for that. You can't prepare for everything. But if you are anticipating some things, then it makes that transition into a bigger scale a lot easier.
Yeah, I want to follow up on a point that you mentioned earlier, and I think that I probably should have asked this before I asked the other question. You talked about some people add on microgreens to an existing farming operation. It's a sub-enterprise under a bigger farming enterprise, and the other route is obviously you just start with microgreens and focus on that. You've had soil-based, in-the-ground vegetable crop experience. You've had growing microgreens exclusively experience. How would you advise somebody to start looking at, is microgreens the right place to start? Meaning, should they go the veg route or should they go the microgreen route? The microgreen route, I think people see as sexy. It's, it's got that lure of the high price trays. It's small space. But like you said, a lot of people do have it as an add-on enterprise, another product that they fold into their farm versus just going at it one-off.
So this is it's a very good question. There's a couple things to consider here. And the first thing, which is a little off the agricultural topic, is what are you like as a person? What conditions do you thrive in? What kind of working environment do you need to be happy? These are important things. So microgreens, in our system, we're actually in contained spaces a lot. We're doing very repetitive tasks a lot. There's a lot of art to it because you've got to pay attention. It's a very fast-growing crop. And so you've got to have that in mind. Like, what do you like? I did a consult for a couple of guys a few years ago, and they were really into it. But when they started the operation, they're like, it's just not who we are. It's not what we do. It's a cool concept, but it doesn't fit with us. So get a sense of whether that is for you. Now, some people take a very much business-focused approach, and they're like, okay, we've got a farm, we've got ourselves, we've got staff, we're going to develop the system, our staff are going to run it like everything else, and it's just going to be a part of the farm. But I think the audience we're talking about is the entrepreneurial type, like, how do I do something innovative, and how do I do something that is going to generate revenue for me? So on a personal level, I like doing things that make use of untraditional spaces, that make really good use of small spaces, just at a level that people aren't used to. So there's a part of my personality that's really drawn to it. So if that's something you really like, that innovation, that coming up with real clever ways to use space, really paying good attention to crop growth, because 8 days cycle, you don't have a lot of room for mistakes, so you've got to really pay attention, then it may be, this may be something you get into. The other thing to think about, and this is two things that got me into microgreens production, are one, I am in an urban environment. And if you want to be successful in an urban environment, you need to have high value crops. And I know Curtis talks about this a lot. You're not going to make money growing potatoes and corn in the city. You need much more space. So salad greens, carrots, the high value crops make the most use out of that space. You get the biggest return per square foot, or in the microgreens case, per square inch. So that's an important piece of it. It's a crop that's going to do well if you've got limited space, and that's why it's so good for the urban environment.
Do you think that this is a fair statement? If you're going into commercial microgreens production, you have to be more of a scientist, more of an engineer, if you will, because it's much more process driven, timing driven, paying attention to all the variables involved versus growing row crop where you're on a lot longer cycles. I think they tend to be more forgiving because you're not in a more contained, controlled environment. And I'm thinking microgreens, especially if it's in a system like yours where it's contained within a very small space, you're very much a scientist, if you will, following procedures, tracking, paying attention to everything going on.
Yeah, so you're partial scientist and you're partial automaton. It's do this or else. Like we have to wash and sanitize our trays after every harvest. We have to clean our shelves once a week. We have to do a bunch of stuff, or the system doesn't work. The risk of disease in a small, contained, intensive growing space like that is too high to skip any step of a process. So it takes time to develop that process, but you only have to have one or two crops get wiped out by molds to understand the importance of that, and you learn pretty quick. The second thing is you need to be action oriented. You can't understand something but not apply it, and the skill that I've learned over the past several years from my own experience and mainly from watching other growers is the other growers that I thought were really good weren't because they had a great connection to the plants. It's because they saw something and they responded to it. A lot of people I talk to and I've worked with see something, but they don't do anything about it. You need to respond to something immediately in most cases. So that's really, really important. And if you tend to be, you're loose with your time, you kind of come and go, you're kind of like, whatever. That's not going to work in this. This is a very discipline-oriented, action-oriented type of business.
Thinking that, I'm thinking you need to be somebody who's very detail-oriented and pay attention to a lot of subtlety. When crops are at optimum time to be harvested, optimum size to be harvested, making sure you're tweaking that. I don't know if that varies much per season or if you're always harvesting, say, sunflower shoots at, making this up, 9 days, or if sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 11, but it depends on other variables. And I'm thinking there's a lot more that you have to be watching and paying attention to and understanding what's happening in this whole cycle versus, like I said, just radishes, which, there's an optimum, but you can pick them at 30 days or 40 days, and there's not a lot of difference there.
Yeah. So one thing I would say is you don't have to be that detail-oriented person, but you have to be willing to become that person. So, I've definitely developed a reputation for being super systematic and super routine-based and super detail-oriented and not missing anything. But I had to become that person because it wasn't who I was before. And in many ways, I'm still not. I can run my microgreens operation very, very tight, but I can't keep my apartment clean to save my life, right? So you've got to be able to apply these things even if it's not who you are, because if you don't, the business won't work. And if you do, the business will work really well. You don't have windows for error in any way. And what you learn over time is how to anticipate things. And so you're doing it before there's even an issue. So I look at the forecast every day. And our crops are generally on a 6, 7, 8, or 9 day cycle, and it doesn't change. And it doesn't change for us because we have complete environmental control. We control the heat, we control the lights, we control the airflow in our greenhouse. But before we had that control, my 8 day cycle might be, this is good, but I see the weather. There's a new weather system coming in. And even with a bit of supplementary heat, it's going to be gray, it's going to be a little colder. I actually need to sow my next crop a couple of days early. So you have to be able to anticipate this stuff, because if you have to sow a crop early, you actually have to be guessing 3 days ahead of time what the weather's going to look like over the next 10 days. So it's easy to miss that. It's easy to make mistakes even when you're paying attention. But if you make a mistake, you need to be able to correct it very quickly. Okay, the weather's actually going to be colder than I thought. I'm going to find a way to get some heat in here quicker. Like, I'm going to do this right away. Or the weather's actually going to be hotter than I thought, so I've sowed too early and I need to slow crop growth down. This stuff is really important because one of the things you need to do is to produce a consistent, reliable product. And one of the things we've built our reputation on is not only the consistency of, say, the size and the texture, but the storage ability of the crop. And sprouts and microgreens kind of have a reputation for spoiling relatively quickly. And so one of the niches we've been able to capitalize on is we go to restaurants and say, like, you're not going to have any waste. So we make sure in our production system that we're always producing in a way that produces that product. Because I can increase my yield on any of my crops significantly. I can grow them in all sorts of different ways. But in doing that, I'd be compromising that storage ability. And that's something that's really, really valuable to people because people don't want to waste food. And when you're used to getting a product like this, which comes to you and it's already spoiled, or a certain amount of spoilage, when you find something that comes to you and a week later still looks like you've just got it, that goes a long way towards you becoming loyal to that supplier. So that's a value that is set very, very high in our production system, and it kind of trumps a lot of other decisions that could be made.
Thinking of all the work involved here, from a very macro sense, can you break down what percentage of work is involved in, say, seeding, harvesting, sanitizing, all the different parts of the process? Again, from a macro sense, I think people think, well, I'm going to seed trays, I'm going to harvest, I'm going to sell them. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. If you had to look at your time, imagine it's a pie and you're breaking it up into chunks. Where do those rough chunks fall in terms of percentages, if you had to guess?
Yeah, so I probably have this down in a spreadsheet somewhere. But let me review sort of what your steps are first, so you've got a sense of that. You've got you're filling your tray with the soil, which is a step that happens on its own. And then you're seeding the trays with the crops, which is a step on its own. You're growing the crops, which is, you're actually doing nothing there. The crops just do their own thing, a little bit of watering, whatnot. And then you're harvesting the crop. And then you're basically cleaning up after that. So cleaning trays, cleaning equipment. So for each of those steps, I kind of look at it as like, how much time do you spend with each tray? And so you can kind of imagine, like, how long does it take me to fill a 10 by 20 tray with soil? It takes you 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds. So, you look at that as the time there. How long does it take you to seed a tray? Well, probably a little longer. You've got some prep to do. You've got to spread the seed. You've got to, get the tray into your greenhouse. So that's, maybe we'll call it 2 minutes per tray or a minute per tray. And then what you're looking at as you're growing, when you're watering, it's like 10, 15 seconds per tray to water a tray, maybe a couple times during the week, depending on your system. And then where things change is when you're harvesting the tray. And when you think of harvesting a tray, you're cutting the tray, you're maybe washing it, picking hulls, spinning it, packaging it, putting in a cool unit. So most of our time goes into the processing part, the cutting the sprout, getting it packaged up and ready for sale. That's where a bulk of the time goes. It's where a bulk of our labor cost as a business is. So yeah, you're probably looking at about, I would say, close to 50 to 60%, maybe up to 60% of our time is in that harvest process. The rest would be sort of prep and the cleanup, and then keeping in mind you've got things like your deliveries and what I would call the maintenance tasks around the site. So those are your production-focused things. And then the other thing to consider is if you have a business, you've always got other things to do. You're replacing things, you're answering emails, you're doing your bookkeeping, you're doing your accounting, you're doing your marketing. That stuff, a good portion of your time will go there, and we often don't consider that as part of our time. So yeah, you're going to spend, 70 to 80% of your time in production, maybe 20% of your time in your admin and marketing, depending where you're at. And most of that production time is going to go into your harvest.
Having done it and having worked with different business partners, employees over the years, what part of that whole process would you say is the weed out process? The part where people get to it and they're like, ugh, I don't like doing this, but I got to do it.
There's several parts in there's sort of, we have basically 5 stations. So it's like our prep area, which is filling trays with soil and seeding. There's the greenhouse, doing work in the greenhouse. There's the harvest process. There's the wash up process afterwards, and there's deliveries. So we do bike delivery. People tend to like that. They're riding around on a bike delivering sprouts. It's like, this is my job. I get paid for this. Probably the two things that don't go over well are the washing trays, like spraying trays with water, especially, mid-December and a crappy rainy day, maybe a bit of snow and some wind. It's cold enough outside and you're spraying water all over the place and inevitably getting yourself wet. I don't wash too many trays anymore. I kind of like, okay, I've done my time there. But it's one of those things that, it's kind of people like, it's not great. The other one is kind of filling trays with soil. There are monotonous tasks that don't have a lot of skill base to them. Once you've got it down, there's no growth there. So those are really real automaton tasks. People like the greenhouse work because it's interesting. You're interacting with the crop. You're seeing the differences in the crop cycle. And we kind of rotate people in our greenhouse because I want people to get to know what that crop cycle looks like. And I'll tell them, like, I can walk into this greenhouse and tell you the second I see a crop, whether it's on schedule, behind schedule, ahead of schedule, and I can probably tell you why. And it's not because I have any special powers or skills. It's just when you're subjected to something so many times, you just see those signs. And so I go through those sort of processes more with people so they get a sense of that and they're appreciating that more. The tasks like the prepping trays and the washing trays, we try to rotate people through that so they don't get that sense of why am I doing this? This is a bit much. So, there's a lot of monotonous tasks that just make it a bit tedious. I think you probably hear from a lot of growers, collecting bills really sucks. You end up chasing people down a lot for that. That's just the reality of every business. Dealing with canceled orders, people not following through on commitments, and these are just the realities of life. So they're not specific to microgreens. But yeah, like I said, there's a lot of monotonous, non-skill based tasks that some people can find fairly boring.
To put this into perspective, can you give people an idea of what scale you're at and how many trays a week you guys are filling with soil?
Yeah, so right now we're probably, and it does fluctuate depending on time of year, the number of farmers markets we're doing, obviously what our sales are. So I think right now we do 2 sowings and 2 harvests a week. So those are both probably about 120 to 140 trays for each of those. So anywhere from 250 to 300 trays per week.
So that just goes to show, if you're looking to grow, it's not just like, I could hear somebody saying, well, filling a few trays isn't so bad. But if you're doing 150 trays in a day, when you're doing that, I can see how that automaton comes in. And I think this is where some of the romanticism starts to fall off this whole idea, and the shiny price per tray starts to get, there's actually work involved there. Beyond the work, just looking at rough economics, to break down, say, a $30 tray, what do you think is a rough profit margin you can expect on a tray like that, given that there's labor in there, there's some soil in there, there's seed costs in there, there's other things involved where you're not taking 30 out of $30. A lot of that's going other places.
Yeah. So that's going to depend on the crop. So we look at a tray, our 2 main inputs are seeds and soil. And realistically, that's $2. So that's not a big cost. Once again, your big cost is labor. And your labor goes into, prepping that tray, seeding it, growing it, harvesting it, and washing it. So there's all those little steps. And I think people forget those things. So you've got to work out a labor cost there. So I think the last time I looked at that, it was about $7 to $7.50 per tray. And that's just for the production. Now, depending on the crop, like we don't have trays that are worth $50. That's not our market. We can price stuff that way and we can grow that crop. But the more fine and the more elite you make your crop by making it a very small, very expensive microgreen, the narrower your potential market is. So our strategy is to have a wider market, grow a larger volume, and get people to treat them like they would treat a salad mix or salad greens and buy big quantities and put them on everything. So our price per tray is a lot lower. So with a sunflower tray, like if we're looking at it from a wholesale, that tray might be worth about $15. So if I'm putting about $7 or we'll say $7.50 into that tray from a production point of view, so basically 50% of that is, you would call it, your profit, and 50% of that is your cost. But the reality is those are just your production costs. So you need to consider, all the time you spend marketing, doing your administration, all that stuff. And then there's the other things that, and we've just added a new component to what we do, so in the beginning we just soaked the seeds and rinsed them, but then it's like, okay, well, now we sanitize the seed. Like we basically don't soak a crop without sanitizing the seed. So that's another cost. We used to use a fairly low cost sanitizer. And as we wanted to evolve the business to basically be more ecological and meet a higher standard, we went to a less harsh, more expensive sanitizer. So our costs go up. We're making the switch from bags. So yeah, bag, your packaging is another cost. Our bags, which we could do for about 10 cents per bag, we've upgraded to a clamshell. So now our cost per has gone up in that way. So there's the producing the tray, and then there's the packaging the tray component. So we're eating away at that again. And so in the end, you're making $1 a tray on a $15 tray or $2 a tray. But this is already, if you think about that, that's the profit above and beyond what you're getting paid if you're tracking that. So we're a business, we all work and we all track our hours and we all get paid per hour. So we're getting paid no matter what. And then as a cooperative, we're like, well, what's on top of that, right? It's that dollar per tray that we're really wanting to get, because the more those dollars per tray profit that the co-op gets, we take that home as a dividend. Now it just always happens that you save up $1,000, $2,000, you put it into that pool, and then boom, it's tax time. Not only maybe you have a tax bill, but you're paying the accountant to prepare your taxes. Like we just spent $800 replacing the lights in our greenhouse. So now that we've been in the business for 8 years, we're starting to replace our infrastructure. So you're always kind of chasing that big amount of money. That is hard to find. It's not that it's not there. We got a dividend payout last year. This year we might get a little bit of something. Everybody's working the hours they want and making the money they need, to a degree. So it's not that there's not revenue being generated and people are making money, but we're not, nobody's retiring on this business. It's definitely, as you're about to get to that point, there's just this other bill that comes up. It's just something in it. It's always the case. And it's a bit frustrating and a bit humorous at the same time, because it's just the reality. And especially if you're growing the business, we need to buy more coolers. We need more ice packs. We need another fridge. We need another, the inspector came in and now we need to replace this and we need to change our process. So that adds labor. So yeah, so once again, you've got that dollar per tray that you're maybe taking home, and there's things that are pecking at it.
So you're much more of a volume business than a margin business, and I don't think that's what people would have expected.
No, and it's once again, so we can access markets. We'll sell like I'm thinking one of our clients right now, they take about 10 pounds of pea shoots a week. Like it's a pretty good size order. Whereas if we're doing, we've started doing micro arugula, so if we look at the base price of our sunflower at say $15 a pound, our arugula, we do at $45 a pound. So it's a realm we haven't gone into, because that's not a food to us. It certainly isn't to me. Like it's a garnish. It's really nice. They're great, but there's no sustenance there. There's no bigger picture. And there's a bit of an ethic around what we do. Is we want to make the food accessible. We want people to eat this kind of food because it's good for you. Micro arugula and micro basil are great, but they're garnishes that make dishes look pretty. So they're kind of they're a niche crop. They're very almost privilege based. And so there's money there. But once again, there's only a small portion of the market that can pay $45 a pound for a product like that. And that's not really our target market. Because they're taking low volume, you lose that customer, like you lose a lot at a time. So the high volume kind of buffers against change in many ways.
Thinking about your trays, if you took labor totally out of it and you weren't paying yourself at all for labor, are you saying that between your seed cost, your soil cost, the packaging cost, that's what, like $4 a tray?
Yeah, so let's take sunflower. I believe the last calculation I did on sunflower was seed and soil was $1.88. We could get, well, if we do it as a clamshell, we get 5 clamshells out of that at maybe 30 cents each. So we'll add $1.50 to that. So what do we at? $3.30. Call it $3.40. Throw the labels in there at maybe 10 cents a piece. It takes us up to about $4. There's a small amount of sanitizer that gets used on the seed. But yeah, in terms of that, we're looking at about $4 for a tray. That could go anywhere from, we'll say there's a range from about $12 to $20 value on that tray.
And how much time unit would you assign to the labor to take that tray from an empty tray to fully packaged product and delivered? Like, is that 30 minutes of labor do you put on that tray? An hour of labor do you put on that tray at the end of the day?
So yeah, going back, I'd have to think about that, how we've done that in the past. So I think it ends up being about like a $5 labor cost, right? So if you look at that, that was probably done at about a $12 to $15 an hour wage. So you're looking at anywhere from sort of 20 to 30 minutes that would go into that tray. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just trying to give people a rough ballpark of where you're looking at this. You have, let's say, $5 rounding up hard costs in there, $5 of labor at the end of the day. Everything beyond that is your profit margin. Obviously, if you're paying yourself more for your labor, that's going to change. So it's one consideration there of you need to think about how much volume you're actually going to move of these microgreens. And this is where I think you need to start looking at, am I going to just do this as a business, meaning just microgreens, and can I move enough of these? Or do I have to go into veg as well to integrate some other crops in here and make microgreens one portion of what I do?
Yeah, and it's we're as a business relatively vulnerable because we have a very limited crop range. Like right now, I think we grow 6 crops, and as you and most listeners will know, diversity is a big buffer against change. So we don't have that, and the way we buffer it through lack of diversity of crop is having a very wide diversity of customers. So we're doing restaurants, we're doing grocers, we're doing farmers markets, we do home delivery. We'll sell to other CSAs. Like we take all those avenues. We don't discriminate. We're not afraid to wholesale either. So yeah, we do try to set it up to buffer some of that. So another thing that comes to mind is, so we can look at it, and I've done like, okay, I'm going to time how long it takes me to prep this many trays, and I do kind of have taken that scientific perspective in the beginning. And as I've run the business, I've moved away from that a little bit. At this point, it really is, we keep fairly good numbers, but it's a matter of, how much money do we have in the bank after payroll? Are we covering our bills? Is everybody getting paid? The reality is certain people that work with us can prep trays as fast as I can, and certain people can't. And we could look at that as a weakness in that person's skill set. But the reality is everybody's going to have a diverse skill set. So when you're doing these calculations, and this is how models work, you've got to have a lot of flex in that model. So I spent a lot of time with these, trying to create these very precise models, and realized that would only work if there were 6 of me working optimally all the time and always getting everything done, which isn't a reality in any way. So the modeling is good, but it's important to be prepared to always, I've just learned with cost, just add 10%. And that tends to buffer those little bits of time where I can prep X number of trays in an hour, but I get pulled away from prepping trays by phone calls, by helping somebody else, by fixing things. So that reality never takes place. The other thing is where we often look at something like, say, filling trays with soil as a bit of a time-sucking and monotonous task. We've got strategies for countering that. So one of the things is okay, everybody stop what they're doing, and right now we're all prepping trays. So number one, we're taking a monotonous task and we're doing it very quickly, very efficiently, and there's a social component to it. And so, like, I'm not even thinking about, is this the best use of everybody's time from an economics point of view? I'm thinking about it from the point of view of, what is this doing for us as a business and as a team? It gives us a chance to talk about what's going on, to cover stuff. It gives us time to just shoot the shit and talk about how the Blue Jays are doing as well. But it's, we don't think about everything in terms of economics. As important as it is, at the end of the day, we need to make a profit in order to survive as a business. But I think those things which are immeasurable and have more of a qualitative aspect contribute to that in ways that are hard to measure. And as an example, we have fairly low staff turnover. People come and work with us and they're like, yeah, the money's not as good as my other job, but I prefer to be here. Or, like, I feel really good about this, and, it's relatively easy work. And, there's something more to it than just coming to a job. We ask people for their input. We give them chances to try new things and let people sort of build their way up. And like the two co-op partners I have now were employees, and they kind of came up and over time I'm like, yeah, come join the co-op and become a partner. So there's those aspects of the model which contribute to the economic success in ways that are much more difficult to measure. So that's important. Like, do you have a team of people around you that support you, that you have a good relationship with? Like right now, I'm actually stepping back from the microgreens operation, and other people are stepping up. And it's a good chance for them to take over some of the responsibilities that I've had and take ownership over that. And it allows me to step back a little bit and have a bit of a breather. So those are important things that will really affect your bottom line in ways that are just hard to tell.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of knowledge there, a lot of wisdom there in those words, and that's something you've just come to learn over time from working in this business for a while, working with a lot of people. And I think this is where your value comes as an educator into this space. And what we're going to try and do on this show, if you're just tuning in for the first time, we're going to take this show for a year, put one out at least once a month, and try and demystify and add some clarity to this whole idea of microgreens, kind of debunk some of the stuff that you do hear out there about this. And one way people can start to get started and get a real good insight into your knowledge is through the online workshop that we offer now. Who's the right person to take that, and what they're ideally going to get out of that workshop at the end of the day?
Yeah, so I think a lot of folks, they are drawn to microgreens for different reasons. As we talked about, they see that high value per tray, which, even though there are costs associated with it, it's a good return. It's a high value for very little space, and it's a crop that regenerates. So you're doing it over and over and over again. A lot of people are exploring ways to get into a microgreens business, or they're exploring a way to do something different with their lives. They've got an office job they don't want. They want to make change. They want to get into agriculture. And even though, as we talked about, there's a lot of detail with microgreens, because you can do it, you don't need a tractor. You don't need the same type of infrastructure. It's a business that can be built with very little capital, and you can learn as you go because you're not investing too much. As part of my original business plan, my sort of my get out clause was, I just stopped doing it. I'm basically was debt free for most of that. So there's not a lot of risk in it when you're, just spending maybe say $10,000 in your first year, which covers, a lot of your supplies as well as your infrastructure. The trick is knowing what you are going to need and front loading a lot of that work. Like what do you expect, or what can you expect, and where do things go? And that's the way I've tried to format the workshop. Like, what are the essential components? You spend all your time with trays, soil, and seeds. Like, so much of the workshop is based around those three things. What kind of infrastructure do I need? What kind of time am I going to be putting into this? What is the flow going to look like? What are all the little things I need to take into account? And as I mentioned, we spend a lot of time on sanitation and hygiene. Part of it because it's regulatory or semi-regulatory. And the other part is when you're growing stuff intensively in a small space, if you don't have good hygiene, you're going to get disease. So trying to give people a sense of what all these different components are. And I notice, kind of one of two things that happen. Like, some people take the workshop and never hear from them again. They're like, fuck this. This is way too much. It's way too much paying attention. It's on all the time. And other people who are just, they're in heaven. Like, this is what I'm looking for. I can see the challenges, but I'm ready to go. And over the years, I've done consults with various people who just pop in once in a while with check-ins and pop in once in a while with, questions. And it really is, they're driven, they're entrepreneurial, and they're action oriented. So, they know they need to get things done in order to make change, and they know to ask for help. They know to go to find resources to help them along. So that's what this is meant to be. It's kind of laying down some of the essentials so you know what to expect. And you don't need to make a bunch of the mistakes that I and guys like Curtis have already made, because we can share some of those lessons with you.
Well, that's it. That's where I think the value is in this course, and really any course. It's avoiding the major pitfalls. A lot of the nuance, a lot of the technique you can pick up anywhere, but it's these subtleties, these death blows that you can learn from in a course like this to help you avoid those types of issues that pay off at the end of the day. One thing I've always liked about the idea of microgreens is, one, it's low capital. You can start it up with a low cost investment, It doesn't take a lot of space to start on a small scale. And I like the idea of having those two and getting experience growing, getting experience dealing with customers, getting experience selling, getting experience tracking numbers. I think it provides a way to get you in the game, if you will, whether you ultimately go just microgreens or not in the long run. I think is, it's an option that's there. But if you want to scale on to veg from there or just grow the microgreens business itself, the fact that you can start small and learn a lot of these key things about the food production business, I think that's where a lot of the value is in a business model like this, because it doesn't cost a lot of money, space to get started and start learning these things. Because like you said, you may be somebody who takes a course like this, you try it out for a little bit and you realize this isn't for me. And in a case like that, you probably haven't plugged down a bunch of money or tied up a bunch of land or got yourself in some sort of big commitments, because none of that's required to start something like this.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The other thing is it's a great type of crop to learn quickly because you're growing it so often. If you think about an 8-day cycle, right, that's 52 crops a year, basically. Every week we're harvesting and sowing 2 crops of several different types of microgreens. So, we're always still learning, and you're always just verifying your theories and the skills you've learned. So you learn that stuff very fast. Whereas if you're growing potatoes, you get 1, maybe 2 crops in a year, and then there's a big, huge gap, and you do it again next year. And if you haven't made good notes, you're like, what was that problem, and how did I deal with it? You can reference some things. The interesting thing about microgreens is this is our 8th year now. And even though while we were fairly innovative 8 years ago with starting stuff up, there was actually a lot of people starting stuff up then. And I think there are some other really interesting models out there. We share Instagram feeds, and we do interact. I interact with other microgreen growers all over the world. So there's more resources out there now for microgreens growers than there was, say, 8 years ago. I remember just trying to find basic information, and it was really, really hard. And I found little bits of things. I had access to greenhouse space, so I could do some trials and some research. But I think people can feel rest assured there's more resources for them now. So it's kind of like I can go to the Rodale Book of Gardening. I can go to thousands of websites to find out what's eating my beets. Microgreens are getting to that point fairly quickly, too.
I hope that this one hit the mark and knocked a bit of that luster off this flashy attraction of microgreens. Because there's a cost to that flash. I love the idea that you have to be part scientist and part automaton. That really puts it into perspective for a lot of people. You're working in a small space, doing repetitive tasks. You better be okay with that if you're getting into microgreens. Because as Chris said, there's a lot of processes that are do this or else. Washing and sanitizing trays after every harvest is one thing that comes to mind. As you heard in this episode, there's a lot more to running this business than meets the eye. As they say, the devil's in the details, and that's where the workload devil is in this one. It's in those detail-oriented tasks that make you a scientist. Keeping records, analyzing results, dealing with mold, and sanitation procedures are all going to take up a lot of your time, leaving you very busy doing stuff that maybe isn't so exciting, and doing it over and over. Given that level of sophistication and the time involved in this business, I would highly recommend taking Chris's online course if you're thinking about starting a microgreens business. There's a lot that you could miss or not think about, and there's better ways to do things that aren't so obvious. It's these subtleties that are critical and required that will make all the difference in the world in this business. And they're covered in detail in Chris's online course. The course covers a lot of these processes, including hygiene and sanitation, crop planning, and regulations. All things you wouldn't think about when starting this business, or at least not initially think about or want to think about. But they're all critical, and they're all required to have a successful business that has longevity. For more details on these subjects and for some sample video of the course, learn more using the link listed in the show description below. That's all for this one today. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for future episodes all about microgreens with grower Chris Thoreau.